instead of a preface. Some questions initially look like arguments about price, marketing, or a poorly designed user interface. But if we look more closely, something far more serious comes into view. A question about the moral architecture of access to knowledge. The discussion is not really about one course, one institution, or one unfortunate price tag. It is about what kind of civilization we become when life-protecting knowledge is offered in forms that feel too expensive, too narrow, and too slow for the urgency of the age. The immediate occasion for this reflection was a concrete case. UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, one of the educational institutions within the UN system, offered a 4-week online course on international humanitarian law for $650. The amount itself is not the whole problem. Institutions do have costs, yet the moral discomfort arises precisely because this is not merely another professional subject. We are speaking about the rules meant to limit human suffering in war. So the question is not, is this expensive or inexpensive for a particular institution? The question is different. In an era when civilians are suffering on a scale the world once hoped never to normalize again, can knowledge about the limits of violence still be offered in a form that is accessible mainly to those who already possess money, language access, institutional confidence, and time? This essay is not an indictment, nor is it a quarrel with the right of teachers to receive dignified support. It is an attempt to look deeper, at the moral logic of access to knowledge, at the boundary between reasonable paid specialization and ethically outdated restriction, and at the possibility of another model, one in which knowledge that bears directly on human life is treated not as a premium product, but as a public good. What UNITAR is, and why higher moral expectations apply to it. For readers who are not immersed in the world of international institutions, it helps to explain briefly what UNITAR actually is. UNITAR is an educational and research institute within the UN system. Its purpose is to strengthen the knowledge and capacities of those who work in government, diplomacy, international organizations, and public life. In simple terms, it is one of the channels through which the institutional world teaches itself how to think and act more responsibly. That is why institutions of this kind inevitably face expectations that reach beyond ordinary commercial logic. When a private company sells an expensive educational product, it is operating within a familiar market framework. When a UN-linked educational body does something similar, the issue becomes not merely organizational, but moral. A higher symbolic status carries a higher duty of example. Status does not reduce responsibility, it increases it. The greater the institutional prestige, the stronger the moral obligation to demonstrate not only quality, but fairness of access. And that is especially true when the subject concerns human dignity, civilian protection, and the boundaries that should survive, even in war. Why international humanitarian law is not just another academic discipline. To understand why this particular course provokes such a strong reaction, it is important not to mistake international humanitarian law for just another narrow specialty. Yes, formally it belongs to the legal sphere. Yes, in full depth it is mainly practiced by professionals. But its object is exceptional. It concerns the minimum restraints that should remain in force when societies descend into organized violence. In other words, this is knowledge about how not to let violence finally slip its chain. When a society loses contact with such knowledge, violence does not disappear. It simply becomes morally and politically easier to justify. The rules may still exist on paper, yet they cease to live in the public imagination. And once that happens, brutality expands not only through weapons, but through ignorance, fatigue, habit, and rhetorical numbness. Even if international humanitarian law in its fullest form remains the domain of professionals, the basic and intermediate levels of understanding should be far wider. Journalists, teachers, civic educators, public intellectuals, civil servants, humanitarian workers, and ordinary citizens all shape the moral climate in which these norms are either respected or abandoned. Knowledge of this kind belongs not only in courtrooms and ministries, but in culture itself. That is why the question of accessibility cannot be dismissed with the phrase, "It is simply a course for specialists." No. It is a course on a subject that touches the moral minimum of civilized life, and that changes the ethics of access. Where the real boundary of the debate lies. It is very important not to reduce the problem to the slogan, "Knowledge must be completely free." That formula sounds noble, but it collapses under serious scrutiny. Education genuinely requires labor. Thoughtful teaching, editorial work, instructional design, translation, moderation, mentoring, and quality control do not arise by magic. To deny this would be sentimental rather than ethical. But the opposite extreme, the idea that any price is automatically justified by costs and sustainability, is equally false. The real boundary does not lie between free and paid as such. It lies between a financial model that supports the spread of knowledge and one that turns access itself into a gate of exclusion. Some things may reasonably be paid for, but the threshold to knowledge that bears directly on human life should not be structured as a premium barrier. That is why the most accurate criticism is not, "How dare you charge money?" It is something subtler and more serious. Knowledge that bears directly on human life should not be reduced to an expensive, narrow, and morally outdated architecture of access. Paid advanced training may be legitimate. Restrictive access to foundational humanitarian literacy is not the same thing. Why a high price feels especially out of place right now. Every moral judgment depends on context. In a world of relative stability, an expensive expert program may be perceived as a professional product. In a world marked by systemic escalation, routinized dehumanization, and the normalization of civilian suffering, the same price carries a different meaning. The time we inhabit changes the ethical meaning of the form. We live in an era in which violence is once again becoming an everyday language of politics. The boundaries of the permissible are eroding not only on battlefields but in the public imagination. People hear more and more about necessity, security, collateral damage, and strategic inevitability, while hearing far less about moral restraint, legal limits, or the dignity of those caught in the machinery of force. That is why a $650 fee for a short online course provokes not merely economic discomfort, but a deeper moral recoil. One intuitively senses a mismatch. Knowledge about what may not be done, even in war, is being offered in a form that feels too restricted for the scale of contemporary human need. The problem is not only money. Language, attention, and the form of access itself. Money is only one barrier, and perhaps not even the most insidious one. If a person merely had to pay and then received vivid, clear, convenient, multilingual education, the ethical picture would be different. But in reality, access is shaped by many layers at once. language, digital confidence, time, attention, institutional style, and the psychological distance created by formal educational products. UNESCO has pointed out that a large share of the world still lacks access to education in a language they truly understand with confidence. For a subject tied to the protection of civilians and the restraint of violence, this matters enormously. Knowledge distributed only in English and only through high-friction institutional channels is not genuinely global knowledge. It is structurally filtered knowledge. Language is not the last obstacle. The very form of transmission often remains suspiciously archaic. Heavy catalogs, registration steps, dry descriptions, formal modules, overly academic framing, and interfaces that feel like administrative corridors rather than educational invitations. Such forms may still produce certificates, but they often fail to produce a living spread of understanding. If we already know that people struggle to complete even short, free, well-designed learning formats, then it is morally stranger still to package critically important knowledge as an expensive, 4-week English language product with institutional friction built into the very path of entry. Institutional inertia and the bureaucratic form of knowledge. In many cases, courses like this are not the result of malicious intent. Far more often, they arise from institutional inertia. Large organizations think in the forms they inherited. They reproduce the templates through which they have long organized training: catalog, registration, fee, certificate, administrative process, moderate outreach, professional audience. None of this requires bad faith. It requires only continuity. Bureaucracy almost always prefers the reproduction of familiar contours. It changes procedure slowly, but it changes imagination even more slowly. As a result, even when a subject demands breadth, urgency, and cultural reach, institutions continue to present it in forms that belong to a calmer and more closed era. The problem is not merely slowness. It is a mismatch between historical reality and institutional imagination. And the sense of the moment is precisely what matters now. The world changed faster than many international educational institutions did. YouTube emerged, podcasts emerged, open licenses emerged, AI-assisted translation emerged, mobile-first learning emerged. The question, therefore, is no longer whether broader access is imaginable. The question is why it is still not treated as the default moral horizon. The core issue is therefore not that institutions have expenses or seek sustainability. The core issue is that the educational form itself often reveals what an institution truly serves: the living spread of knowledge or the preservation of its own familiar prestige logic. That is an uncomfortable question, but it is an honest one. Knowledge as commodity and knowledge as service. Behind the discussion of one course lies a deeper philosophical question. What is knowledge in the first place? If knowledge is simply a commodity, then everything makes sense. There is value, there is brand, there is audience, there is price. Access becomes a matter of purchasing power, and education becomes another sector of the service economy. Yet human civilization has long carried another intuition: that some kinds of knowledge should not be fully subordinated to buying and selling. This is not a naive dream in which every teacher must live like an ascetic. It is a more serious insight that when knowledge bears directly on life, suffering, moral formation, and the prevention of harm, its transmission acquires a public and ethical character that exceeds ordinary exchange. Older spiritual and philosophical traditions, including Indian ones, often viewed the commercialization of knowledge with deep suspicion. They understood that when knowledge is tied to life, duty, and inner formation, Its transmission can be corrupted if market logic becomes the sovereign principle. That insight should not be romanticized uncritically, but neither should it be dismissed. It points toward a civilizational truth modern institutions often forget. Here, the essential distinction appears. The problem is not that a teacher or institution receives support. The problem begins when the financial model governs the very design of how knowledge is transmitted. When education starts asking first, how do we maximize revenue, prestige, and controlled access? Rather than, how do we serve truth, the learner, and the public good as widely as possible? Something central in pedagogy begins to decay. Why the argument, "Only specialists need this anyway," fails the test of reality. Even if we grant that deep training in international humanitarian law is primarily needed by professionals, it does not follow that institutions may calmly keep access narrow or expensive. On the contrary, if the lives of others may depend on the judgment of public officials, lawyers, commanders, humanitarian personnel, or policy actors, then the moral argument for lowering barriers becomes stronger, not weaker. A near paradox emerges here. The most common defense of expensive programs sounds like this: it is for professionals. But if those very professionals are among the people whose understanding may influence whether norms are applied, ignored, or hollowed out, then wide and serious training becomes a matter of public interest. The greater the downstream human stakes, the less convincing exclusion by price begins to look. Moreover, the state of the world suggests that the problem is not merely the existence of norms, but the deficit of living understanding and application. It would be naive to claim that every violation of humanitarian law is caused by ignorance. Many actors know perfectly well what they are doing. Yet it would be equally naive to believe that the present level of public, institutional, and professional understanding is adequate. A world that normalizes atrocity is not a world that has learned these norms deeply enough. The right conclusion, then, is not that all paid education is immoral. The right conclusion is that knowledge of this kind must be distributed far more widely and far more deeply than it is now, especially among those whose decisions, commentary, policy work, or institutional habits shape the fate of others. The technological era already offers another path. One of the most important facts of our time is that an alternative architecture of access already exists. Open educational resources, supported by UNESCO at the normative level, proceed from the simple but transformative idea that educational materials can be shared, adapted, translated, and redistributed rather than locked behind each institution's own bottleneck. This does not abolish quality. It changes the moral default. This intersects with the newer conversation about artificial intelligence in education. UNESCO rightly emphasizes the need for a human-centered approach to generative AI. But the significance of the moment is clear. Translation, adaptation, subtitling, multilingual accessibility, and the rapid production of entry-level learning materials have become dramatically easier than they were even a few years ago. The technical excuses for narrow access are weakening. There is also a more grounded but no less important layer. YouTube, podcasts, short modules, mobile lessons, offline packets, multilingual landing pages, nominal fee certificates, donor-supported open courses, public lecture series, and blended models in which advanced mentoring is paid but foundational knowledge remains open. None of this is theoretical anymore. The tools already exist. The only question is whether institutions will use them in proportion to the urgency of the times. That is why the old argument, "otherwise it cannot be done," sounds less and less convincing. The issue is no longer technical possibility. The issue is whether institutions are prepared to reconfigure their imagination. What a morally mature model might look like. If we try to think constructively rather than merely critically, a fairly clear model begins to appear. It can be imagined as a three-level structure. The first level is public. It should be free, multilingual, short, clear, and easy to circulate. This is basic humanitarian literacy. What international humanitarian law is, why civilians must be protected, why not everything becomes permissible in war, what proportionality means, what cannot be justified even under pressure. This level belongs to society at large. The second level is applied and scalable. It can be inexpensive, partly automated, structured around self-assessment, short thematic tracks, and moderate certification. This is the space for journalists, teachers, civic educators, NGO staff, public servants, and others who need more than a basic introduction, but not a high-cost professional specialization. The third level is advanced and professional. Here, higher prices may be justified. Live case analysis, expert feedback, specialized seminars, serious certification, institutional customization, and profession-specific intensives for lawyers, officials, and international practitioners. In other words, payment is attached not to the right to approach the knowledge, but to the additional depth, labor, and recognition surrounding it. Such a model does not destroy sustainability. On the contrary, it makes sustainability morally intelligible. The institution earns not by monopolizing access to essential knowledge, but by providing additional depth, accompaniment, and professional value around an open foundation. What this debate means for peace education. At a deeper level, the dispute over an expensive course in international humanitarian law concerns not only law and not only war. It concerns the fate of peace education itself. Peace education often fails not because its ideas are wrong, but because its channels of transmission are too weak, too abstract, too culturally narrow, or too late. Knowledge arrives after habit has already hardened. That is why knowledge must move toward people not only from above, as the administrative distribution of a limited resource, but outward as a cultural, ethical, and educational ecosystem. Podcasts, short explainers, translations, open texts, children's materials, family learning, public lectures, multilingual archives. All of this becomes part of peace infrastructure. Knowledge ceases to be a scarce good and becomes a living civic environment. In that sense, criticism of expensive courses is not a gesture of negativity. It is an attempt to remind us of a forgotten priority. Knowledge on which life, dignity, and the limits of violence depend should spread widely, quickly, and in forms proportionate to the human reality it seeks to serve. Conclusion. The question is not about one course, but about the type of civilization we want. A dispute about a 4-week online course priced at $650 may seem like a minor episode against the backdrop of global catastrophe. Yet it is often in such episodes that the hidden logic of an era becomes visible. We see how civilization imagines knowledge, whom it imagines as worthy of access, what it treats as a public good, and what it quietly leaves to market sorting. If the knowledge that should restrain war remains expensive, English-centered, bureaucratically heavy, and oriented primarily toward a narrow paying audience, then the problem is deeper than one course catalog. It means that the moral distribution of knowledge has not caught up with the realities of suffering. So the central question is this: Do we want to live in a world where humanitarian literacy is understood as a public good? Or in a world where even knowledge about the limits of violence remains a privilege of those who can pay, navigate the language, endure the friction, and move confidently through institutional corridors? The answer to that question will shape not only the future of education. It will shape whether civilization can learn faster than it destroys. And if we still hope for such a turn, we will have to acknowledge a simple truth. Knowledge that should restrain war must not become a luxury.